Mitch Prinstein, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You're a psychologist. You just published a book called Popular, The Power of Likability in a Status-Obsessed World. I'm curious, popularity, it's a touchy topic for a lot of people. What got you researching that idea, popularity and particularly status?
Yeah, I have been interested in popularity since even I was a kid. I'm not sure exactly why, but I was always so curious why some folks were so much more popular than others. It was when I got to grad school that I started to realize that it turned out to be way more important than even I had thought. I was surprised to learn how much popularity affects our health and our futures and our kids, and it really just took off from there.
You mentioned in the book, at the beginning of the book, that you taught a course at, I guess you're at UNC, right? University of North Carolina.
I am.
Yeah. You taught a course on popularity, and you didn't think it would garner much attention, but it was like one of those classes where kids were, sitting in the alleyways trying to hopefully someone would drop the class so they can get in. I mean, why do you think people are so interested in this topic?
Yeah, it was crazy. That first time that I taught it was actually when I was at Yale, and They don't have a pre-registration system. So anyone who wants to take a course just shows up. And when I got there was this huge crowd outside the building, which I had no idea was for the class, but it turned out that 500 kids had showed up to take this. I asked them, why are you all so interested in this topic? Are you looking to feel better about your own high school experiences? And that wasn't it at all, actually. I was really surprised. These kids at Yale, they had some really cool opportunities, and many of them had already been interns at, for Congress people, and they had worked in hospitals and in sports teams. What they said was that popularity is a dynamic that continues to play out in every way imaginable as adults. It really matters for who gets hired or not. It matters for who has their ideas heard versus not. It even relates to our happiness. And they recognize that. These really smart kids really saw that popularity dynamics, it's not something we typically learn, but it's one of the most important skills that we have. And they wanted to know how to succeed as adults.
I think when most people think about popularity, they probably think back to high school, where I think this was more so when we were in high school or growing up, where being popular meant you were a football player or a cheerleader, you were kind of a jerk, etc. But in your book, the idea of popularity that you're highlighting is much more nuanced than that, and that there's actually different types of popularity. What are those two types, and what are their characteristics?
Yeah, so one type of popularity is exactly the kind that you say. It's those cheerleaders, football players, the ones that were maybe even a little bit aggressive or mean to others, but somehow they had that kind of status. Everyone knew them, people wanted to be like them. That is one kind of popularity, but it's not the first one that we experience. The first kind of popularity we start experiencing, believe it or not, as young as when we're 3 years old. And when you ask a 3-year-old who's the most popular, they pick the kid who's the most likable, someone that makes them feel good, someone that they enjoy spending time with. And that likability factor continues to be a form of popularity that is important for the rest of our lives. But our adolescent brains kind of turn us on to this brand new form of popularity that starts at around the age of 11 or 12. And it's that status type. The reason why it's really important for people to pick up on these two very different types is because they lead to completely opposite outcomes.
Okay. So yeah, when I read that, so there's status popularity. I've read other psychological research on the area of status and whatever. And there's some other people have differentiated between the two. Like there's status popularity be like dominance, right? Where you kind of achieve that status by, you can be aggressive, etc. And then likability sounds a lot like prestige, where it's more of an earned, where you're useful to people, and because of that usefulness, because you're helpful, people will give you status.
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, about 30% of those who have high status are also really, really likable. The rest of them are actually quite hated by others. And similarly, there are many, many people who are likable but never have any status at all, but they still benefit from having likability. We really do want to be likable and want our kids and coworkers to be likable. It helps in pretty mysterious and fascinating ways. But status is all about kind of the dominance and aggression and really making yourself seem somehow better than or more important than others.
So you often hear people say, oh, status doesn't matter. Who cares what other people think? I don't care what other people think about me. But you highlight research in the book that shows that low status can have some serious detrimental effects on people. What are some of the downsides of low status?
Yeah, so if you're low in likability or low in status, it actually does lead to a lot of negative outcomes. Most of the research has looked at those that are disliked, and those folks indeed are at much greater risk for problems down the road. They tend to be, the low likable kids tend to also be aggressive, and they miss out on so many opportunities where either they could have gotten ahead or they could have learned better skills. They're the last invited to every party. They're the last to learn how to date and make friends. And they're the last picked to be part of groups, even as adults. And that kind of gives them a disadvantage that continues to perpetuate, year after year, context after context.
And it's not only, the social stuff. I mean, this actually can affect us physiologically as well, right?
Yeah. So, I had no idea that this was such a powerful force, but it turns out that our bodies are really very programmed to make sure that we are part of the herd, because I guess it used to be the case that, maybe 60,000 years ago, that being surrounded by others and accepted by others really guaranteed our survival. If we were alone, there was a better chance that we would die. So we now see that the brain responds really dramatically at the very moment that you start to perceive that you might be getting excluded or rejected. And that trickles down, believe it or not, even to our DNA. There's dormant DNA that we're all walking around with, but it's shut off. And at the minute that you start perceiving that you might be excluded, that DNA turns on, and it turns on in a way that activates what's called a pro-inflammatory response. In other words, it prepares your body to be injured, because that's what would happen to you if you were alone, years ago. And because we are now in a society where you're not likely to get injured at the moment you're excluded, that inflammatory response is unnecessary and actually becomes harmful. It's interesting that the vast majority of diseases that we're affected by as humans today are because of this hyper-inflammatory response.
Yeah, like going back to that idea where people say, I don't care about status. What I think they often, when they say that, what they mean is like, I don't care about a particular type of status, or I don't care about having status or belonging to that particular group, but they need some sort of status, whether it's part of a different group. So you might not be, if you're in high school, you might not be a football player, but you could do something else. You need to be a part of some sort of group.
Exactly. I mean, we don't necessarily all want to be the cool kids anymore, or we don't want to be celebrities necessarily, but it is in fact human nature to care about the way that you interact with others. We are a human species, and we may not be the kind of species that cares about it in the high school way anymore, but we are a species that is attuned to our standing among others. And we individually care about connections with others, absolutely in very profound ways. And what's important is that I think that those folks that pretend to think that popularity is completely irrelevant might be missing out on a few really important ways that they could be helping themselves and being a lot more happy. There's a important medium place between being too concerned about popularity and pretending that you don't care about it at all, because it's more important that we recognize it's a real force in our lives, and let's use it for good.
So let's talk about this status type popularity, the one I think we often think of when we think of popularity. You mentioned earlier that there's people, you can be popular and have this sort of status popular, but at the same time be despised. Or how is that possible?
Yeah, so the people who have the highest status, whether they be CEOs or those cheerleaders and football players, there are a couple of problems. The first is that, especially if they experience that as kids, they tend to be, research says, a bit too focused on their standing and their status. Every interaction is measuring up whether others have as much status as them. And when they have failings, they tend to attribute it to being too concerned about status. And that's a problem, because no one likes a status seeker. We kind of look at that as being too egregious as an attempt to garner attention and acclaim. And, that's a turnoff. But the second important issue is that one of the most effective ways of getting status is to be aggressive, to put others down as a way of making yourself a little bit higher on that status hierarchy. And aggression is the single biggest predictor of being disliked. So what happens is you have these high status folks who can never stop caring about their status. They put other people down in really aggressive ways, and they seem so focused on their status that they're no longer actually connecting with people as people. They're just instruments to make them feel more important and more noticeable. And that is how people who are too focused on status become really, really disliked.
And then eventually that dislike will eventually kind of knock them off the totem pole, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everyone that I interviewed for the book and everyone who's ever been in a workplace probably can tell you the story of the corporate climber who was able to, get really high, but ultimately they reached a limit because they were so dislikable and they were used others so much that it finally all collapsed for them. And, that happens in so many different ways. We all know those stories, and they're true. That's exactly the way that the research says that it works.
And this also happens with chimpanzees. I know that there's some males that can become the alpha male through dominance, where they just basically beat the crap out of the other ones. But eventually, like, the other chimps team together and they beat the crap out of the alpha chimp and make him go away. And they put in someone else who was more. There's actually, I think chimps have the same idea of status. There's like dominant status and there's prestige status. You can climb up the chimp hierarchy by being grooming the other chimps, providing food, etc. And those are the ones that tend to stay on the top the longest.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not an accident that we have that similarity, because the part of our brain that cares so much about status and is responsive to social rewards, it's not the part of the brain that's unique to humans, which is more the cortex. It's the part of the brain that's really primitive. It exists in a lot of species. And it's this part that says that we will be rewarded when we think about, look at, or have any interaction with high status people. And whether we're on Instagram or whether we are feeling that kind of influence and that power in offline worlds, it activates that part of the brain. So if we seem pretty similar to other less developed species in that way, that's for really good reason. And there is something very kind of primitive and animalistic about the ways that some people seek status and attack others in order to get it. It in fact is exactly the way that we see among chimpanzees.
So this status type popularity, it comes with cost eventually. And I mean, eventually you'll be, hoisted on your own petard. But you also highlight there's psychological cost for pursuing this type of popularity. Like, it actually makes you feel terrible, even though you're feeling good too a bit.
That's right. There's a remarkably high rate of depression among CEOs. Celebrities will be the first to tell you that they're awfully lonely. And, a number of the celebrity interviews in the book really talk about exactly the process of how status starts to create a persona that's not really who they are, but they have to maintain that persona and feed that persona. And people end up really being interested more in the persona than the person that they really are, and that makes them very lonely. Research that has followed those most popular kids in high school, or has looked at the folks who have high status as adults, have found that they're at much greater risk for substance use, loneliness, anxiety, and problems with their relationships. Their closest friends and partners actually don't think that they have good relationships with those high status folks.
So, I mean, if this type of popularity, this status dominance type popularity comes with, social and psychological loss, why do people even seek it? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's part of who we are as humans. We are those kinds of animals that care about it. We used to be a species that would grow out of that desire to be high in status and be cool in that way. But things really changed. They changed somewhere in the 80s when our society started to focus more and more on ways that anyone could try and get that instant fame and status. And really, if you look at it, the entire dialogue and the virtues that we care about as a society started to change. Instead of relying on one another and caring about community and connection, everyone wanted what sometimes is called the American dream, but really has morphed into having your own reality show and having the most Twitter followers and somehow making yourself seem more important than everyone else. And we are now a society where you can exist pretty independently. You can even just sit at home and have everything delivered to you and, feed your Facebook profile. It's no accident that the more that we have distanced ourselves from others, the more we've started to favor status over likability. And that's become a really big concern. In some ways, we've kind of developed a society to make us all want the very thing that will hurt us the most.
Yeah. And you also highlight research too in the book that the status seeking popularity that people go for, like it actually can make, like it shuts down parts of the brain where, the executive control, like sometimes people do terrible things. They know it's terrible, but they do it anyway, so they know that it will get them some sort of status.
Yeah. So that part of the brain, that real primitive part of the brain, it's of course connected to all the other parts of the brain. And people are starting to figure out now, once you activate that kind of part that's really responsive to that status, or what neuroscientists call social rewards, we're starting to learn a little bit about like how that affects the other areas. And one of the areas that it has a direct line to apparently is what's called the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of like the brain's brakes. It's, what stops us from doing impulsive things. And yeah, the more that we kind of get that status experience and we get the activation of the social rewards part of our brain, it seems to shut down the brakes. So we're more prone to do impulsive acts, especially because people with high status get rewarded every time they do something aggressive and impulsive. So it kind of teaches them, if you want higher status, keep on doing aggressive, impulsive stuff. These days we all wake up in the morning and see exactly what's happening on Twitter and who's saying what in the political world or elsewhere. And we see this process playing out every day. It's exactly the way the research discusses it.
Right. It made me think of, there's like a kid on YouTube. He's not a kid. He's a grown man now. He does like pranks, and he basically just is annoying. He just makes people feel terrible. But he gets a lot of YouTube followers because of it, and gets a lot of views because of it. So that's probably what's going on.
Yep, exactly.
All right. So let's talk about likability. Right. So status, dominance, popularity is the not good kind. What can people do to be more likable? I think we refer to a little things, some things you can do. Just be useful, be helpful to others. But what are some other things people do to become likable?
There's so many things that we can do because there's not one single recipe, but there are a couple of things that seem a little bit less obvious that I think are really important to highlight. Because a lot of people think that in order to be likable, you have to kind of kowtow to everyone else's wishes and you have to somehow be passive. Turns out that's exactly wrong. The most likable people are actually the best leaders. And the way that they lead is that they make everyone feel included. And that's key, is you make people feel like they're part of the herd. And you suddenly become the leader of the herd for doing so. The ways that you might do that is, rather than tell other people that their ideas are bad and wrong and your ideas are better, it's to make sure that everyone feels like their input was important, appreciated, it was met with a positive response, and then maybe synthesizing that and moving people in the direction that you think is necessary. That's okay, that can work. In fact, that's a really good idea to do, but not by overpowering others' opinions or making them feel less than. That's really important. Other ways that we make people feel part of the herd is just by generally being very positive and enthusiastic around them. When they feel like their presence is met with enjoyment and kind of, being really pumped by the fact that they're around and the things they have to say, they automatically like you because it makes them feel like, wow, I'm an important part of this interaction. I'm needed, I'm wanted. And we're kind of programmed to want to feel needed and wanted. So you make people feel that way and they're going to like you forever.
Yeah, it sounds like the archetype for this. A few years ago, we did a whole series about Dwight Eisenhower and his leadership style. And like Ike was like that. Like that's what made him such an effective leader. He was optimistic. He listened to people. He tried to make people feel involved in the process. And as a consequence of that, like people saw him as a leader.
That's right. A lot of people will talk about the boss that they would be willing to do anything for. And when you ask them to tell you about that boss, they'll say things like, they would shake my hand and look me right in the eye. And I really felt like they knew who I was or cared who I was. Or they'll tell you about somebody who, met them years ago, but still remembered their name and something important about them. It's those people that make you feel truly cared about and connected, that make you feel part of the herd and like your presence is important to them. Those are the people that we tend to like the most. They also become those with the highest status because they use their likability very wisely. It's very different than the person that gets high status because they've stepped on everyone else.
So how do you know if you're likable or not? Right? That's you might think you are, but you're actually not.
Yeah, that's a really good question because we're actually not the best judges of this ourselves. I sometimes joke that you should gather all of your friends in a room and ask them. And if the room you're in is empty, then that gives you the answer that you need. But if you do speak with others and you feel like you're getting a positive response from them, in other words, they're happy when they're around you, they're smiling, they're laughing, that's kind of a good yet obvious kind of clue. A lot of us can look at our relationship histories. Is there a pattern of people getting close to us and then more distant? Is there a sense of people getting more agitated with us? Do people seem to get more energized when we're around them, or do they seem to kind of start to downward spiral into a negative loop? These are the best ways we can tell, but in the research, we don't ask people how likable they are because we don't expect them to give us a valid answer. We have to ask the people around them, and they give us the information that we need.
So let's go back to this idea of how our status as children and how that can follow us into adulthood. First off, why is that, right? I mean, when you're an adult, sometimes I feel like I'm a completely different person than the kid I was when I was 14. Yet the research shows that experience I had as a 14-year-old is influencing me now. So what's going on there?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on, but one of the things that happens is that it turns out that in our mind's eye, we sometimes do think of ourselves still as being young. It's kind of an interesting duality. A lot of us will say, I'm a completely different person. I'm not at all the adolescent that I used to be. But other times we might feel like the way we looked back then or the way that people treated us back then still haunts us a little bit. There's even a study that shows that it's not how tall you are as an adult that predicts your salary. Tall people make more money than shorter people. But it's how tall you were when you were 16 that makes a bigger difference. As if we carry around that mental image of who we were as an adolescent for the rest of our lives. And there's now research to support that. Those old autobiographical memories when we were young, they actually serve as a filter. They are biasing us, what we see and how we interpret what we see every single day. There's a really cool study where they asked folks with prior histories of being popular and prior histories of not being popular to all watch the same exact video with social interactions. And what they found was that the people who grew up popular, they tended to focus on the parts of the video where people were having positive interactions. They even had them wear eye tracking devices to see what their eyes looked at. And they found that those people spent most of the time staring at the parts of the video where people were happy and having good interactions. The exact opposite happened for people who grew up unpopular. They spent their time staring mostly at the negative interactions in that same video. And when asked later to talk about what the video was like, they told a very sad story about the exact same video. And the reason why that's important is because that's what's happening to us every day. Two people walk away from the same experience with a somewhat different interpretation of what just happened. And that all stems back to what happened to us in adolescence, believe it or not. That's what's guiding these filters and biases.
What is it about adolescence that sort of sets this stuff in stone, that really makes it makes status top of mind, like we're more attuned to it?
Yeah, so there are two times in our life when our brains change really dramatically. One is when we're infants, but the second is the transition to adolescence. And that's when we really develop kind of the brain that we will have for the rest of adulthood. And we start to learn how to store, these memories for a long time. Our brain does that well. Adolescence is the time that we start to establish our first sense of a firm identity. If you ask little kids about who they are as a person, they don't really have a good answer, but if you ask an adolescent, they use a lot of words that reflects how much they're starting to understand themselves as a person that's different from others and has stable traits. there's something about the primacy of our identity being established in adolescence for the first time that ends up being really powerful. It's probably why when you ask someone about popularity or about their adolescence, they still talk about it kind of emotionally sometimes. It's as if that experience just happened, even though it could have been decades ago. That stuff in adolescence sticks with us. It's really an important part of who we are, even decades later.
So basically, we're establishing patterns in adolescence and how we interact based on our status carries over to adulthood. Like, what can we do as adults? Let's say, we have this tendency to not be likable. We do things because that's just what we're used to. Like, how can you get over that high school self of yours and start acting in a way that will allow you to be likable and gain more status in a positive way?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important one. This is what I really hope people can get from the book and why I wrote it, is to finally get over kind of all of those experiences and be able to live a happier life now. So here's what needs to happen. Most of us tend to think that we are so beyond our adolescence, that we're completely a different person now, and none of what happened to us before is relevant. We try and sweep it all under the rug. That's the problem, is that we are likely to repeat the patterns that are happening if we don't acknowledge that those are the patterns that we have. The first thing we need to do is just come to terms with who were we as adolescents, and let's not sweep it under the rug. Let's talk about it. And let's think about how that might be making us a little more sensitive to rejection now, or a little too prone to expect the worst from people now. Let's own that stuff. And then once we recognize that, it's actually remarkably easy to start noticing when we're falling into that trap. So when we're in an interaction, we walk out assuming that something bad just happened, checking in with others and getting a sense of whether everyone saw it the same way. And when you realize that you are maybe in the minority in that interpretation, starting to realize, wait a minute, I think that that's a little bit of the legacy that came from my adolescence. Let me check myself on that. Let me open up the possibility that my automatic reactions to things might be a little bit biased. And once you start getting in the habit of just questioning those automatic, what feels like your instincts, and realizing that they've maybe not helped you so much, it starts to become really easy to change them and to change your biases and your filters in ways that are really, really powerful. But the first step is realizing that you have a bias at all, which means taking those memories out from under the rug and really looking at them.
And then people start noticing as they start acting and acting in a way that makes them more likable. There's like a positive feedback loop that begins, a virtuous cycle that starts.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you walk into a room and you have your arms folded and you're not making eye contact, research says that people around you, it will actually change their mood. They will feel badly. They will feel more depressed, and they will attribute that to every time you walk in the room, you're kind of the downer. This is kind of another way that we repeat patterns. We kind of assume I'll be rejected when I enter this new experience, and then we behave in ways that reify and guarantee that we'll be rejected. Well, it turns out it's just as easy to change things the other way. If you walk into a room expecting something positive to happen, then without even trying, it's actually more likely that you will get a positive outcome just by having that expectation. And when that happens, it tends to feed on itself in this incredibly cyclical and powerful way. While researching the book and kind of thinking about some of those things myself, I was able to even try it out, in a few different ways, and talk with people who have done that and look at research. And the effects are incredible. Just the most subtle things that you do in a social interaction, or ways that you think about expecting acceptance and being more popular and having favorable outcomes, it can trigger a cycle that lasts for days and weeks and months.
So you've talked about it a little bit, but how has social media influenced our status drive? I mean, this is a relatively new thing, right? Like the past 10 or 12 years, where everyone can have a platform, basically. That didn't exist in the 80s or 90s. So how has that changed the status game?
So social media, can be used in a lot of different ways, and it can be used as a way of connecting with others and becoming more likable. sharing things and, developing relationships, all that can be great. And there's some evidence to say that social media can be really helpful. But the problem is it also opens up a potential trap, because social media really emphasizes status. It tells you on the front page the number of responses that you've gotten, or likes or followers or retweets, whatever platform it is. There's a lot of emphasis on quantifying measures of basically status. How much did people notice you? How much reach and influence do you have? And the truth is, for the same reasons that we talked about before in the brain, that actually is addictive. Seeing that and getting that temporary rush of seeing that you had 300 retweets, that feels really good, and it makes you more likely to want to do it again. And some people really get trapped in only tweeting things or only posting things as a way to get others to like them and follow them and retweet what they're having to say. And it starts to take the humanity out of it, and we start to become those chimpanzees that are just bar pressing in order to get more signs of status. That's a problem. It's a problem when we start to, lose the opportunity to make real connections and focus only on getting these temporary hits, these biological rushes, much like we would get from drugs. It's also a problem when we see research studies that show that you can actually influence someone's attitudes and beliefs just by pairing things they used to hate with markers that those things got lots of likes. There's now evidence to say that just seeing something you hate associated with a lot of likes makes you hate it a lot less. And that's a pretty scary way of thinking about attitude and influence and persuasion that also is potentially dangerous.
Yeah, that is scary. Yeah, it reminds me, there was that study done about music. It was like the Stanford Music Lab, where in one group they had people listen to different music. There was just dance music, whatever, and people could see how many likes or downloads a song was getting, and the more downloads or likes a song got, the more it got, right? It's sort of like this snowball effect. But in the other factory, people couldn't see what other people were ranking these songs, and people ended up ranking things differently. So yeah, just seeing something, it reminds me of Gangnam Style, that YouTube video that was one of the most played YouTube songs ever. It wasn't a good song. I think it was terrible. I think if most people, if they listened to it by themselves, not knowing what other people were, liking or, sharing this thing, I think most people are this is not that great of a song. But because everyone saw that it was the most downloaded song on YouTube, everyone started listening to it more. This is actually a great, catchy song.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how much we are influenced by popularity? Try to resist clicking on a website that everyone tells you is the best website. Try to, not talk about something that everyone else is talking about. It again goes to our basic human programming. As soon as we learn that there's something that everyone else seems to like or has visited or prefers, it tempts us, it pulls us in interesting ways to suddenly want to see it. We have to know about it. We have to hear about it. And in many cases, it does influence our preferences. Yeah, people will love Gangnam Style because they heard that everyone else does, even though objectively, there's no reason that anyone should ever love that song. And yeah, that's what the research found as well. They manipulated that list of who had downloaded what songs. And when they took the worst song and they made it look like it was everyone's favorite, suddenly everyone started thinking it was their favorite too. It's amazing how much we're all conformists at heart, whether we think that that's happening or not.
So how do you use social media without experiencing these downsides? 'Cause you said it can be like a drug, right? And most times if you have a drug addiction, you stop using the drug completely. Social media, you're suggesting you can use social media, this potential drug, but not have the effect of that drug of, that status drive. Do you have any suggestions, and based on your own experience or maybe the experience of your students, and how you can navigate that?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is, just like we might say for other things that are potentially addictive, use it in moderation. Catch yourself. If you start finding that you're getting a little bit too stuck on it, use it in moderation. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, I think we all get pulled to try and post things or say things because we're wondering how will that play on social media. Even as publicizing the book, I was encouraged to try and develop a social media profile, in order to sell the book. So it became very meta for me to do the exact things that I had written about doing or not doing. And I could see the traps. I could really see it. I would get followed by somebody who had millions of followers, and I would start thinking, oh, well, what could I say that they'll retweet? And then once they retweet it, then maybe I'll get their followers. And there was this pull to start to say things just to game the system, whether I, firmly believed in those things or not. And that was, to me, a really good sign of, wait a minute, if I'm doing these things only as a way of gaining status, but I don't sincerely care or believe in them as much as it might seem, that's a bad sign. That's when you need to log off, for a little while and kind of realize that you are being, lured into the world of status, and it's no longer a genuine expression of who you are anymore. So that to me was a good warning sign of when I needed to take a pause.
So I know a lot of our listeners are parents, and you end the book talking about what parents can do to help their children navigate the world of status. 'Cause as you said, this is something that affects us significantly throughout our lives, but no one really sits down to tell you, here's what you can do to be more likable, and here's how you shouldn't, seek status popularity. So knowing that likable children tend to do better later in life than unlikable or even unpopular kids, should parents go out of their way to make their kids likable? I mean, for example, my kid's starting, school, and I've already seen this happen. The parents, every parent in this class is having a back to school party, and there's 3 of them or something this week, and I'm just that never happened when I was a kid. I'm geez, parents, take it easy. So should parents go out of their way to groom their kids' social life so they're more likable?
Maybe they should, because all the things that we teach kids, whether it's reading or writing or, other skills that are formally taught in school, those are important. We should be teaching those. But the research does say that teaching kids that are likable tend to have greater success in every measure at work, their salaries, their relationship happiness, even their children's happiness. It's all predicted, and it predicts above and beyond all those things we formally teach. So I would say, yes, we absolutely should be teaching kids how to be likable. The key is to make sure that we understand the difference between the two kinds of popularity, and we don't accidentally start teaching them to become popular in the way that refers to status, because that will lead to bad outcomes. So I really hope that people are able to use the information that's provided in the book really well to, it's basically kind of an instruction manual of exactly how to help think about the factors that are making your kids more or less likable, and how to avoid the traps that will make them care too much about status, which is what we don't want.
Well, Mitch, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book?
The book is called Popular, and it's available at all major retailers, of course. And my website is mitchprinstein.com. And that also has some links to the book and some other resources.
All right, Mitch Prinstein, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My guest today is Mitch Prinstein. He's the author of the book Popular, The Power of Likability in a Status-Obsessed World. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can also find out more information about his work at mitchprinstein.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/popular, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.